The morning sunlight fell softly over the rolling green hills that surrounded Hollowford Estate, the kind of golden light photographers pray for on wedding days. The historic venue, a 200-year-old manor tucked deep in the English countryside, was waking to the quiet hum of activity. Staff hurried between the main hall and the guest cottages, carrying armfuls of flowers, trays of champagne, and the endless small details that kept a wedding running on time. By 8:30 a.m., the bridal suite on the second floor was ready. Its centerpiece, the makeup room, was prepared for the bride's arrival. The space was elegant in a way that carried its age. A line of antique mirrors, each framed in carved oak, stood above a wide vanity table polished to a soft gleam. It smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Marissa Kane arrived just after 9. At 27, she was stepping into what friends would later call the happiest day of her life, though no one could have known how those words would change in meaning. Witnesses remembered her stepping out of the Blacktown car in a simple white dressing gown, her hair loosely pinned back, a garment bag draped carefully over one arm. She had insisted on arriving earlier than anyone else in the bridal party. According to her maid of honor, Emily Hart, Marissa said she wanted a moment to breathe before the chaos began. She had grown up only 30 minutes away, in the market town of Larchfield, where she met her fiancé, Liam Mercer, during a summer volunteer project in their late teens. They'd been together nearly a decade by the time this morning came. In the days leading up to the ceremony, friends noticed her calm demeanor. She didn't seem jittery or overwhelmed, quite the opposite. She was meticulous in her planning, but never flustered. Staff at Hollowford later recalled her being warm and polite as she greeted them, thanking the makeup artist for coming so early. She set her phone on the vanity, pulled out a few personal items from a small pouch, a hairpin, a delicate handkerchief, and a lipstick tube. The color was bold, striking against the pale morning light. Crimson Promise. She told the makeup artist she'd chosen it months ago because it made her feel like herself. For the next hour, the estate moved around her. Bridesmaids drifted in and out, some still in pajamas, holding coffee cups. The photographer poked his head in briefly, taking a test shot of the room's natural light before retreating. Outside, guests began to arrive. The morning air filled with the faint sound of music from the garden where chairs were being arranged for the outdoor ceremony. Around 10:45 a.m., Emily stopped by to check on her. She found Marissa seated at the center vanity, lipstick in hand, smiling faintly into the mirror. Emily teased her about practicing her vows. Marissa laughed softly but said nothing more. That smile, that lipstick in her hand, would be immortalized minutes later when the photographer returned to take a quick portrait. It was the last confirmed image of her. By noon, the final preparations were underway. The florist brought in the bouquet, a cascade of white roses and pale pink lilies. Liam was waiting in the garden, dressed in a charcoal suit, his best man adjusting his tie. Guests had been asked to take their seats. The coordinator sent Emily upstairs to fetch the bride. What happened between that last photograph and the moment Emily returned remains a mystery that has consumed investigators, family, and strangers for years. Emily knocked on the door twice before calling out. There was no reply. Thinking Marissa might be fixing her hair, she tried the handle, locked from the inside. That, she would later say, was the first moment a thread of unease touched her. She knocked again, louder this time. No answer. She ran to get the venue manager. The door was still locked when staff arrived, and after a brief exchange about whether to force it open, the manager fetched a spare key from his office. It didn't work. The lock, original to the manor, had jammed before with age, and now seemed stuck entirely. There was no sound from inside. At that point, urgency replaced hesitation. A maintenance worker forced the door open with a shoulder shove that splintered the frame. Inside, the makeup room was still. The chair was pushed neatly under the vanity, the untouched champagne sat on the table, and her phone remained on the counter where she'd left it. The bouquet lay in its paper wrap on the chaise lounge. Marissa Kane was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no open windows, and no place in the small room for someone to hide. Every mirror reflected the same thing back at them, an empty space where the bride should have been. Some of the staff stood frozen, half expecting her to walk in laughing, saying she'd stepped out for a moment. But seconds stretched into minutes, and reality settled into the air like a heavy fog. Guests waited below, unaware. Somewhere between the last photograph and the walk down the aisle, a bride had vanished, and no one in that building could explain how. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence. Not the kind of quiet you'd expect in a closed room, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the air as the makeup room door swung open. The old wood frame groaned from the forced entry, splinters scattered at the threshold. Inside, nothing looked out of place, and yet the absence of the bride felt like a glaring wound. The chair sat perfectly aligned with the vanity, as if whoever had used it had taken care to leave the room neat. The champagne on the small side table hadn't been touched. Condensation still clung to the glass, proof it had been poured not long before she vanished. Her phone rested by the sink, the screen dark, a faint smudge of foundation powder on its edge where her hand must have grazed it. A staff member checked the windows first. The makeup room had two, narrow, tall panes of old glass that overlooked the east lawn. They were latched from the inside, undisturbed. The sills were clean, no fibers, no torn fabric, no scuff marks. A thin layer of dust in the outer grooves lay unbroken. One of the venue coordinators knelt down and ran a finger along the lower edge of the wall where the light from the window hit. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dust that had collected under the curtains. It was as if she had simply evaporated from the center of the room. The small vanity mirror reflected the doorway, the growing crowd outside it, bridesmaids craning their necks, a groomsman hovering awkwardly, and the estate's event manager quietly trying to usher them back into the hall. The mirror's surface was clean, wiped down that morning by staff. On the countertop, the scattered brushes and foundation compacts suggested a session mid-progress. But one thing stood out. In the open makeup kit that Marissa had brought from home, one item was conspicuously missing, the deep crimson lipstick she had been holding in the last photograph. Emily, her maid of honor, was pale, trembling slightly as she told the staff this was Marissa's favorite shade, a limited edition tube she'd been saving for months. She had reapplied it twice that morning, something Emily found odd but brushed off at the time. Now, with it gone and Marissa missing, the detail hung in the air like an unspoken question. The estate's manager quickly made the decision to clear the upstairs entirely. The bridal party was ushered to the West Lounge, a large room usually used for evening receptions, while guests in the garden were told there was a brief delay in the ceremony. Liam, the groom, remained outside, pacing, unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding above him. Police arrived within 20 minutes, their first action to secure the room. An officer stood guard at the door while another began taking photographs of every surface. They documented the locked windows, the untouched champagne, the absence of any struggle. The door's antique lock was inspected. There was no sign of tampering from the outside, and the key was still inside the room, resting on the vanity in plain view. This detail immediately complicated the timeline. Whoever had been in the room last had either locked it from within or found a way to do so without being present. The lead investigator, a 30-year veteran of the force, later said the scene struck him as eerily polite. Nothing knocked over, no rush of movement, no chaos. It was the kind of order that didn't match most missing person situations, where panic or violence left visible traces. That stillness made him uneasy. By 1:15 p.m., the decision was made to treat the situation not as a misunderstanding, not as cold feet, but as a possible abduction or disappearance under suspicious circumstances. Officers began canvassing the estate, moving through the reception hall, the gardens, and the service corridors. They spoke briefly with staff, instructing them not to discuss the matter with guests. Downstairs, music still played softly from the ceremony speakers, masking the tension creeping through the building. Back upstairs, forensic technicians dusted the room for prints. Most belonged to Marissa, the makeup artist, and Emily. No unknown fingerprints were found on the windows, door handle, or vanity. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but no loose or hollow panels revealed hidden compartments. The investigator noted that the only missing object, the lipstick, had no immediate significance beyond being personal property, though its absence was logged. An officer returned from the garden to report that no one had seen her exit the building. The only external door near the bridal suite led down a narrow staircase to the east side of the property, where kitchen staff had been unloading catering supplies all morning. They swore they hadn't seen her. By mid-afternoon, as rain clouds began to gather over the estate, the locked-room nature of the disappearance was already taking shape in the minds of those investigating. Every logical route she could have taken was blocked or accounted for. Every witness who might have seen her claimed they hadn't. And somewhere in the chaos, the image of that last photograph, her faint smile, the lipstick in her hand, was already becoming the centerpiece of a case that made no sense. By the time the first uniformed officers finished securing the upstairs corridor, the quiet elegance of Hollowford Estate had shifted into the controlled chaos of an active search. Squad cars lined the gravel driveway, their radios murmuring updates. The property's long, manicured lawns were soon dotted with search and rescue personnel in high-visibility jackets, their boots leaving tracks in the damp grass as they began sweeping the grounds in slow, deliberate grids. It was just after 2 o'clock when the search officially widened beyond the building. K-9 units were brought in, handlers guiding their dogs along the perimeter of the manor and into the gardens. The scent trail, according to early reports, began and ended at the makeup room door, fading completely just beyond it. One handler later remarked that it was as if the trail had been cut off rather than lost to distance. This finding didn't slow the effort. Teams moved into the estate's outbuildings, a cluster of storage sheds, a glass-walled conservatory, and a disused stone barn now used for storing event furniture. All were checked, all were empty. Beyond the formal gardens, the estate stretched into 40 acres of lightly wooded land bordered by narrow country lanes. A search line was formed at the tree line, officers and volunteers moving in unison, calling her name. Drones were launched from the open field behind the manor, sweeping the forest canopy and tracking heat signatures, though the late summer warmth made it difficult to distinguish anything unusual. Divers entered the estate's ornamental lake, their dark wetsuits cutting through the reflective surface where swans drifted in the distance. Silt was disturbed, weeds combed through, but nothing was recovered. Back inside, detectives began the first round of interviews. The bridesmaids were gathered in one of the smaller reception rooms, each giving their account of the morning. Most described it as a typical pre-wedding bustle, hairstyling, adjusting dresses, last-minute changes to the seating chart. None recalled hearing any unusual sounds from the makeup room. Only one, a friend named Chloe, hesitated before mentioning something that had struck her earlier. She said that when she'd passed the open door around 10:30, Marissa had been seated alone, holding her lipstick, slowly twisting it up and down while staring into the mirror. She'd reapplied it more than once in the span of a few minutes, as though waiting for something. Chloe admitted she'd thought it was nerves, maybe even a way to calm herself, and had said nothing until now. The remark was noted, but not pursued at that moment. Liam was interviewed next in a separate room, away from friends and family. Officers found him pale, confused, and insistent that Marissa would not have run away. He recounted seeing her that morning briefly before she went upstairs, described her as calm and affectionate, and claimed she'd been looking forward to the ceremony. He had no idea what could have happened, and his frustration was apparent as he realized the police were already considering possibilities beyond a simple delay. The makeup artist, a woman named Fiona, told investigators she had left the room just after 11 to fetch a setting spray from her kit in another part of the building. When she returned a few minutes later, the door had been closed. She assumed Marissa had wanted privacy and didn't knock. Fiona said nothing else seemed strange during their time together. They'd chatted about the weather, the flowers, and nothing more. As the hours wore on, the estate became a staging ground for the search. Temporary lights were set up in case efforts continued after dark. Officers worked their way into the cellars beneath the manor, guided by the head groundskeeper through narrow, uneven corridors that smelled of earth and damp stone. Every chamber was checked: wine storage, disused boiler rooms, even an old servant's passage bricked up decades earlier. None contained any sign of Marissa or her belongings. By evening, the search radius extended into the surrounding countryside. Local residents were approached, their properties checked with consent. Farm ponds, ditches, and hedgerows were examined. Still, there was nothing. No torn fabric, no dropped jewelry, not even a single shoe. For a disappearance that had happened in broad daylight, on a day when she was the center of attention, The lack of physical evidence was staggering. As darkness fell, the manor's great hall sat eerily silent, tables still set for a wedding feast that would never happen. The guests had been sent home hours earlier, many still in shock, unable to process how the day had turned so quickly. Upstairs, the makeup room remained cordoned off, a single strip of police tape marking the threshold. Somewhere between the final moment she was seen and the first knock on that locked door, Marissa Kane had slipped out of sight entirely. No one knew how. No one knew why. And with each passing hour, the chance of finding her alive seemed to fade into the night. Within days of Marissa Kane's disappearance, the story had spilled far beyond the quiet boundaries of Hollowford Estate. National newspapers ran headlines about the vanishing bride, and local radio stations speculated on what could possibly have happened in a locked room in broad daylight, surrounded by family and friends. Online forums ignited with theories. Some posts claimed she'd been secretly unhappy and had staged her own escape, pointing to the missing lipstick as a deliberate symbolic clue. Others were more sinister, suggesting a jealous ex-boyfriend or even her fiancé might have been involved. Every smiling photo of Marissa that surfaced was dissected by strangers for signs of doubt or coded messages. The police were careful with their statements, confirming little beyond the basics. She had been last seen alone in the makeup room. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, and she was now missing under suspicious circumstances. But privately, detectives began narrowing their focus to the structure itself. Hollowford was a sprawling manor house built in the early 1800s, its walls concealing generations of alterations and forgotten spaces. A retired groundskeeper came forward with a memory from decades earlier, a servant's passage that had once connected the upper floors to the cellar network below. It had been sealed up long before the estate was converted into a wedding venue, but he swore it had run directly behind the wall of what was now the makeup room. The idea of a hidden passage electrified the investigation. If it still existed in some form, it could explain how she had left without being seen. Specialized teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar, mapping the walls and floors for voids or anomalies. The scans showed irregularities in the masonry, but no open spaces large enough for a person to move through. When a section of wall was carefully opened for inspection, all that emerged was solid brick and centuries-old dust. The passage was gone, or at least gone enough to be useless. Attention shifted back to the people closest to her. Liam was interviewed multiple times, his timeline scrutinized against phone records and guest statements. He was cooperative but weary, repeating that he had nothing to hide. Detectives also re-examined the bridal party's movements, especially in the final hour before the disappearance. Every bridesmaid's account had minor inconsistencies, moments where they couldn't clearly remember where they were or who they were with, but nothing that tied directly to Marissa's vanishing. As police kept their cards close, public suspicion deepened. A rumor surfaced about a man seen near the east side of the property that morning, walking quickly toward the road. Another claimed a member of the catering staff had been fired weeks earlier after a dispute with management. These whispers fed into the growing belief that someone inside the event had knowledge they weren't sharing. For the investigators, the hardest part was the absence of anything tangible. No fingerprints out of place, no signs of struggle, no discarded belongings in the surrounding countryside. Even the missing lipstick was a dead end. It could have been in her possession when she vanished, or it could have been taken by whoever was responsible. By the third week, the search effort had shifted into a different phase. Officers were no longer combing the woods daily. Instead, they were reviewing hours of security footage from nearby roads, cross-checking guest lists, and following up on tips from the public. Each lead fizzled quickly. Theories kept multiplying, everything from an elaborate kidnapping to a psychological break, but none survived serious scrutiny. The media cycle began to move on, replaced by newer headlines. For the Kane family, that change was devastating. Every day without progress deepened their fear that the truth was slipping away. And in the quiet corridors of Hollowford Estate, the makeup room remained closed, the splintered doorframe still unrepaired, as if waiting for someone to finally uncover how a bride could disappear without a trace. For Marissa's parents, the weeks after the search ended were not a period of acceptance, but the start of a long, consuming spiral. They refused to hold a memorial, insisting she was still out there somewhere. Every rumor, no matter how implausible, was pursued. They drove hours to meet strangers who claimed to have seen a woman matching her description in service stations or roadside diners. They called psychics who promised they could sense her energy and followed vague directions to abandoned farmhouses or rural bus stops. One night, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they pitched a small tent just outside the gates of Hollowford Estate. They told a local reporter they were there to listen for her voice, convinced the quiet grounds still held some trace of her. Liam did not join them. In the months after the wedding day, he stopped appearing at press conferences. Friends said he rarely spoke about Marissa at all. By the following spring, he had moved to another county. 2 years later, word spread that he had remarried. He declined all further interview requests, telling the Kane family through his lawyer that he had nothing more to contribute to the investigation. For Marissa's parents, his absence became a wound of its own, a symbol of how quickly the world seemed willing to move on. Desperate for answers, they hired a private investigator, a former detective named Alan Reeve. He began by revisiting the original witness statements, focusing on the bridal party. It was in these transcripts that he noticed small but persistent inconsistencies. One bridesmaid had claimed she saw Marissa in the makeup room at 11:30 a.m., but another placed her outside the same room only minutes later, speaking to a florist. When pressed in follow-up interviews, both admitted they weren't entirely sure of the times. Another bridesmaid, Chloe, who had earlier mentioned Marissa's fixation on her lipstick, struggled to recall whether the door to the makeup room had been open or closed the last time she passed it. Alan believed these gaps didn't necessarily indicate foul play among the bridesmaids, but they did cast doubt on the precise moment Marissa was last seen alive. If her disappearance had been planned, even by someone else, there was enough confusion in the timeline for it to have gone unnoticed. But speculation wasn't proof. And without physical evidence, none of it could move the case forward. The Kane family's search drained their savings. They paid for forensic specialists to re-examine photographs from the wedding day, hoping someone might spot a shadow in a mirror or a face in a window. They requested the police reopen the sealed servants' passage behind the makeup room wall, only to be told it had already been fully investigated. Each effort ended the same way, with no sign of her, no clue to what had happened. Hollowford Estate, meanwhile, began its own quiet transformation. The damaged lock on the makeup room was replaced, the doorframe repaired, and the walls repainted a neutral cream. By the third year, the room was once again in use for weddings and events. Guests who walked in would have seen nothing unusual, just another softly lit space with mirrors and fresh flowers. For the Kanes, this was almost unbearable. The place where their daughter had been seen for the last time was now just another backdrop for photographs, its history invisible to those who didn't know. By the 5th anniversary, even the local news had stopped calling. The police file remained open but inactive, a thick folder of interviews, photographs, and maps that seemed to lead nowhere. The Kanes kept their own file at home, a smaller box with printed tips, postcards from psychics, and the last photograph taken of Marissa, seated at the vanity, holding her lipstick. They couldn't explain why they still checked the phone every time it rang, or why, even after all these years, they caught themselves glancing toward the driveway at night, as if one day she might simply walk back in. It was early spring when Hollowford Estate prepared for another wedding, the kind of day that echoed the calm and beauty of the one 7 years earlier. The air was cool, the gardens beginning to bloom, and the same upstairs makeup room had been reserved for the bride. Most of the current staff were newer hires, with only a handful having been there during the infamous disappearance. For them, the room's history was a quiet footnote, something mentioned only in hushed tones to those who asked. That morning, a makeup artist named Leanne unlocked the door and began unpacking her brushes and palettes. She was alone for the first hour, arranging products on the vanity, when something caught her attention. In the main mirror, just above the right-hand corner, there appeared to be a faint smudge, not on the glass she was looking at, but in the reflection itself. She leaned closer, but the glass was spotless to the touch. In the reflection, though, it was clearly visible. A small, perfect curve of lipstick, as if someone had pressed their lips gently against it. The color was striking, a deep, rich crimson that seemed too bold to have been left accidentally. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see another mirror behind her causing the illusion, but there was only the wall. She shook it off, telling herself it was a trick of light or a residue from the last event. She worked the rest of the morning without mentioning it. The wedding went ahead without incident, but a month later, a bride in the same room reported seeing something similar. This time it was during her own preparation, while her bridesmaids were chatting and music played quietly in the background. She called one of them over to look, but by the time the friend approached, the mark had faded or vanished. Staff assumed it was nerves, brides seeing things in the rush of the day. Over the summer, however, the reports multiplied. They were not confined to the makeup room. Guests began telling the estate manager about faint lipstick smears appearing in the mirrors of the ladies' bathroom, on the glass of the east corridor, and even in the staff kitchen. Each time, the color was the same, a deep, unmistakable crimson. Cleaners confirmed they could wipe the marks away easily, but within weeks, they would reappear somewhere else. What unsettled the staff most was how fresh the smears seemed. They weren't faded or dulled as if left for days. They looked new. The pigment intact, as though applied within hours, and yet no one had ever been seen making them. The estate had begun installing discreet security cameras in some public areas after a string of minor thefts the previous year, but the footage revealed nothing. Mirrors that had been clean in the morning would have the smear by evening, and no person ever appeared on video placing it there. One incident in late August drew particular attention. A bridal party in one of the guest rooms was preparing for the ceremony when a bridesmaid glanced at the tall mirror in the corner and froze. The lipstick mark was there again, the same shape, the same color, but this time she swore it hadn't been there minutes before. She touched it lightly with a tissue, smearing it slightly, and noticed the vivid stain transferred instantly to the fabric. It was real lipstick, not paint or a trick of reflection. When word reached Leanne, the makeup artist who had seen the first mark months earlier, she finally shared her own story with colleagues. The detail of its placement and shade matched exactly. It was then that one of the older staff members quietly pointed out that the color sounded familiar. She remembered the police questioning her years earlier about a missing lipstick, a rare shade called Crimson Promise, the same one Marissa Kane had been wearing the morning she vanished. By autumn, the strange appearances had become an open secret among staff, whispered about but rarely discussed with clients. Those who had been at Hollowford long enough to remember the investigation avoided certain mirrors entirely, claiming it wasn't worth the discomfort. And though no one could explain it, there was an unshakable sense that the smears were not random. They seemed deliberate, placed in spots where someone, or something, wanted to be noticed. It was a September wedding that pushed the strange stories at Hollowford Estate beyond whispers among staff. The bride, a woman named Claire Morton, had chosen the same upstairs makeup room that had once belonged to Marissa Kane's timeline. While her bridesmaids were busy adjusting dresses, Claire noticed the now infamous crimson smudge on the right edge of the central mirror. She had already heard the rumors from the coordinator during a casual conversation weeks before, and this time, she decided to document it. She pulled out her phone, snapped a photo, and later that night posted it to her Instagram story with a short caption, "Tell me this isn't creepy." The post might have faded into the flood of wedding content online, but a follower sent her a direct message within an hour. The woman claimed she recognized the shade immediately. Crimson Promise, a deep red discontinued years ago. She said she still had an old tube of it at home, untouched, because it had been her favorite color until it vanished from store shelves. Claire thought it was an odd but harmless coincidence until another friend, a local resident, replied with something more unsettling, that Crimson Promise was the same lipstick worn by the bride who had disappeared in that very room 7 years earlier. Word spread quickly. Within days, online forums dedicated to unsolved cases were picking apart Claire's photograph, comparing it side by side to the last known image of Marissa holding the lipstick in the same room. The match was undeniable. The same bold undertone, the same almost burgundy hue. For people who had followed the case from the beginning, it was as if a dormant wound had been reopened. The police, aware of the growing online interest, made a discreet return to Hollowford. Forensic specialists were brought in to take samples from a fresh smear found in the estate's east hallway mirror just 2 weeks after Claire's wedding. Under magnification, the pigment was confirmed to be real lipstick, not paint or reflective trickery. Chemical analysis revealed an exact match to the original formulation of Crimson Promise, a product that had been off the market for 6 years. There was no explanation for how a discontinued shade was appearing in random places around the building, or why it was still as vibrant as if it had been applied moments earlier. More troubling was the age of the samples. Laboratory tests suggested the smear had been placed within hours of being collected. The texture was soft, the oils unbroken by time or heat. Whoever, or whatever, was leaving them was doing so in real time, not as some lingering stain from the past. This prompted a review of security camera footage. The estate had cameras in the hallways, in certain event rooms, and in staff-only areas. Investigators focused on mirrors that had later been found with lipstick smears. In every case, the cameras showed the mirror clean one moment and marked the next, with no recorded person entering the space in between. In some instances, the gaps were less than 20 minutes. It was as if the mark appeared instantaneously, without human presence. By the winter season, staff attitudes toward the estate's mirrors had changed entirely. Some refused to clean them alone after dark. Others, particularly those who had been there during the original investigation, avoided rooms with larger mirrors altogether, citing an uneasy feeling they couldn't shake. A night porter admitted to quitting after finding a fresh crimson smear on the inside of a locked supply cabinet's mirrored door. Management tried to keep the matter quiet to avoid scaring clients, but word of mouth worked faster than they could contain it. Brides began requesting makeup areas without mirrors, a request that was almost impossible to accommodate in a venue built on old-world charm. The lipstick marks were no longer an occasional curiosity. They were turning into a pattern, their appearances unpredictable but unmistakably deliberate. And for those who remembered Marissa Kane, the reappearance of her exact shade felt less like a coincidence and more like a message. 7 years after Marissa Kane's disappearance, the case file was pulled from storage and placed back on an active investigator's desk. The sudden reappearance of her exact lipstick shade in multiple locations, confirmed by forensic testing, was enough for authorities to authorize a fresh look. This time, they approached Hollowford Estate with more advanced tools, newer forensic techniques, and the advantage of hindsight. The makeup room, long since refurbished and in regular use, was once again sealed off and treated as a crime scene. The first focus was the mirror where Marissa had been photographed on the morning she vanished. Under normal light, it reflected only the empty room and the faint wear of age on its wooden frame. But when technicians swept an ultraviolet beam across its surface, something unexpected appeared. Along the edges, invisible to the naked eye, were smudged, partial fingerprints, faint loops and whorls that fluoresced in the glow. Several were too incomplete to match, but 2, taken from the upper right-hand corner, were identifiable. The prints matched Marissa's driver's license records. What unsettled investigators most was not the match itself, but the fact that these prints had not been documented during the original 2018 investigation. The initial forensic sweep had found no usable prints on the glass at all, yet here they were, clear enough to be compared and confirmed. Experts debated whether they could have been preserved all these years, but consensus leaned toward something far stranger. The prints were newer. If so, someone, or something, with Marissa's exact fingerprints had touched that mirror after the original search. Attention returned to the building's structure. The old servants' passage, long rumored and partially documented in the estate's historical plans, had been dismissed during the first investigation after scans suggested it was sealed solid. But technology has improved. Engineers brought in ground vibration sensors to detect movement within the walls and subfloor. Over 2 nights, the sensors picked up sporadic readings, faint, irregular knocks from the direction of the sealed passage. The sounds were too inconsistent to establish a pattern, and no one could pinpoint their source. They were loud enough to register on equipment, but too soft to be heard clearly by people in the room without amplification. Investigators pressed for permission to breach the sealed wall and explore the area behind it, but the estate's owners balked. Hollowford had become a lucrative wedding venue again, with a waiting list stretching more than a year in advance. Shutting down operations, even temporarily, meant losing substantial revenue. They allowed night monitoring and non-invasive scanning, but refused any demolition work, citing the risk of structural damage and the financial hit of prolonged closure. The partial prints were sent to independent analysts who confirmed the police findings. The smudges suggested a slow, deliberate touch, as though someone had run their fingertips along the glass rather than brushing against it accidentally. Combined with the lipstick smears appearing in other parts of the estate, the evidence painted an unsettling picture, one in which Marissa, or someone intimately connected to her disappearance, had returned to that room in the years since. For the lead detective, the case now straddled an impossible line. On one side was the practical explanation. Someone had obtained Marissa's fingerprints somehow and was deliberately planting them to unsettle the estate and draw attention to the cold case. On the other side was the fact that no one could explain how the lipstick marks appeared without witnesses or camera footage, or why the fingerprints showed no signs of aging. Despite mounting pressure from the public and renewed media attention, the estate continued to operate, hosting weddings in the same building where the investigation was unfolding. Brides walked past the makeup room door, unaware that behind it, crime scene tape still hung and vibration sensors still pulsed faintly in the dark. And somewhere beyond the sealed wall, in the hours when the hallways were empty, those unexplained knocks continued. The winter wedding had been planned for months, a small, intimate affair at Hollowford Estate just a few days before Christmas. The gardens outside were bare, their fountains drained for the season, and frost clung to the stone balustrades. The main hall was warm and golden with candlelight, the air scented faintly with pine from the decorated tree in the foyer. For most of the guests, it felt like the perfect setting for a romantic ceremony. For the few who knew the building's history, the beauty came with an edge of unease. Some of the staff, in quiet conversations over coffee that morning, had already remarked that winter weddings tended to feel different here, quieter, the old manor's age more pronounced in the long shadows cast down the corridors. The bride, a 29-year-old named Sophie Delaney, had heard the rumors about the lipstick marks, but had dismissed them as local folklore when she first booked the venue. By the time her wedding day came, she was too caught up in seating arrangements and last-minute alterations to think about ghost stories. She had chosen the upstairs makeup room for its light, even in winter, and for the large mirror at the center of the vanity. She and her maid of honor spent the late afternoon there, with the rest of the bridal party drifting in and out as they dressed. There was laughter, champagne, the usual flurry of curling irons and mascara wands. By early evening, the guests were arriving downstairs. Sophie stayed behind in the makeup room, giving herself a few moments to breathe before the ceremony. Her maid of honor had stepped out to check on the bouquet. Alone, Sophie stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the skirt of her gown. The room was still, the muffled sound of music from the hall below just barely audible through the old floorboards. She leaned closer to check her lipstick, a pale rose she'd chosen to match her flowers, and it was then that she caught movement in the glass. In the reflection, over her left shoulder, a woman stood in the far corner of the room. She wore a white dress, older in style than Sophie's, the fabric pooling faintly at her feet. Her lips were painted a deep, unmistakable crimson, and in her right hand she held a lipstick tube. Sophie's breath caught. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared into the mirror as if looking at her directly through the reflection. Instinctively, Sophie turned around. The corner was empty. The air felt colder, as though a draft had slipped in from nowhere. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she told herself she was imagining it, that the stress of the day was playing tricks on her. She turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. But now, on the edge of the glass where moments earlier there had been nothing, was a fresh smear of deep crimson lipstick. The curve of it was precise, as if someone had just pressed their lips there and stepped away. The shock hit her like a physical blow. Sophie's knees weakened, and she dropped into the chair before she could collapse entirely. Her chest felt tight, her hands shaking so badly she could barely reach for her phone. When her maid of honor returned moments later, she found Sophie pale and trembling, pointing mutely toward the mirror. The smear was still there, vivid against the glass. Downstairs, word spread quickly among the staff. The estate manager came up, saw the mark. and instructed a junior attendant to take photographs before anyone touched it. Sophie insisted she knew what she had seen, that it was the missing bride, Marissa Kane. She described the deep red lipstick in detail, the way the woman had held the tube. The story reached the groom before the ceremony began, and for a moment there was talk of postponing. Sophie, still shaken, agreed to go ahead but refused to return to the makeup room for the rest of the night. When police arrived later, called by the estate manager, out of caution, the smear had already been wiped by housekeeping despite instructions to leave it untouched. The officer on duty noted Sophie's account but found no physical evidence to support it. There were no fingerprints on the mirror, no sign of forced entry into the room, and the hallway camera showed nothing unusual. Still, Sophie's testimony wasn't the only one from that night. 3 guests, independently and without knowledge of her claim, later told police they had seen something odd in the upstairs corridor near the makeup room. Each described it differently, but the core was the same, a brief flash of white moving quickly past an open doorway, gone before they could turn their heads. One thought it was a staff member in uniform. Another assumed it was Sophie herself, though she had been elsewhere at the time. The third said it felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. By the end of the week, Sophie's account had reached local papers. They linked it immediately to Marissa's case, reprinting side-by-side photos, Sophie's crimson smear in the mirror, and the last known image of Marissa holding her Crimson Promise lipstick. Online forums reignited, speculating that Marissa had returned to the room on the anniversary of her disappearance, or that the estate was haunted in some residual, inexplicable way. Others argued it was a cruel hoax, staged by someone with access to the venue and an interest in keeping the legend alive. For Hollowford Estate, the incident brought unwelcome attention. Bookings were canceled. Couples who had weddings planned for the following year demanded to be moved to other rooms. Several longtime staff resigned, citing unease about working late shifts near the makeup room. A petition began circulating among local residents to have the building closed entirely until the passage behind the wall could be opened and examined fully. The owners resisted, just as they had in earlier years. They argued that nothing had been proven, that there was no conclusive evidence linking the lipstick smears or Sophie's sighting to Marissa's disappearance. But the pressure mounted from the public, from the press, and from within the community itself. The makeup room, they finally conceded, would be locked indefinitely. No more brides would use it. No more photographs would be taken there. Sophie has never changed her story. In interviews, she describes the moment in the mirror with a kind of detached clarity, saying she remembers every detail of the crimson lips, the pale dress, the stillness of the figure behind her. She says she doesn't believe she saw a ghost, only that she saw Marissa Kane, exactly as she had been the day she vanished, standing in the same room after 7 long years, holding the same lipstick she was never found with. And that, no matter what anyone believes, is what will stay with her for the rest of her life. The investigation into the events at Hollowford Estate was never officially closed, but by the time the 7th anniversary had passed, the tone surrounding the case had shifted. It was no longer treated as an active manhunt or a solvable crime. The files still sat in police storage. The evidence was still technically logged for potential trial use, but to anyone outside the immediate circle of Marissa Kane's family, the disappearance had hardened into one of those strange, unyielding mysteries that people discussed in low voices with phrases like, "We'll probably never know." Yet the story refused to fade away completely. It was kept alive not by formal investigation, but by the small, persistent disturbances that continued to occur inside the manor. The crimson lipstick smears, first written off as rumor, then reluctantly acknowledged by the estate's owners, did not stop when the makeup room was locked. Instead, they began appearing in other parts of the building. Sometimes they would surface in the upstairs guest rooms, sometimes in the mirrors of the east corridor, sometimes in the staff areas far from any public access. There was no pattern to their placement. A month might pass without incident, only for 3 separate marks to appear in a single week. Forensic teams, when called, always found the same thing. The chemical composition matched perfectly with the discontinued Crimson Promise lipstick. That exact shade was no longer manufactured anywhere in the world. Even the brand's archives confirmed it had been discontinued and its formula retired 6 years earlier. The smears were never dried out or faded when discovered. They were fresh, as if someone had applied them within hours. And every time, the surrounding area was checked for prints. When anything turned up at all, they were incomplete, smeared beyond identification, not enough to match to a suspect, but enough to prove that human contact had occurred. Cameras installed throughout the estate failed to capture anyone in the act. In some cases, the footage showed the mirror completely clear in the morning, only for the mark to be visible in the very next recording, sometimes less than 20 minutes later. No one entered or exited at that time. Staff schedules were checked, guest movements were verified, and still there was no explanation. The police, wary of devoting extensive resources to what was increasingly treated as an anomaly rather than a prosecutable crime, visited only when new reports came in. The conclusion in their notes rarely varied. Unexplained occurrence, no suspect identified. The estate's management, already under pressure after Sophie Delaney's widely publicized experience, decided they could no longer allow the makeup room to be used for weddings or private preparation. They had the locks changed, the door reinforced, and the windows covered. Officially, they told couples that the room was undergoing long-term restoration work. But within the village, the truth was an open secret. The owners would not risk another incident in that space. Marissa's parents were the only ones who seemed entirely unmoved by the shifting public interest. They never treated the case as a curiosity or a ghost story. For them, it was not about lipstick or mirrors, but about their daughter, a person who had walked into a room on what should have been the happiest day of her life and never walked out. Their home became a kind of quiet museum to her memory. In the hallway, beneath the family photographs, stood a single frame containing the last image taken of her, sitting at the vanity, smiling faintly, holding the tube of crimson promise. Next to it, under glass, was a handwritten note she had left for her bridesmaids that morning. The handwriting was neat, the tone light, almost playful. At the end of the short letter she had written, "I'll see you in the mirror." No one knew what she had meant by it. The bridesmaids said they thought it was a reference to checking her appearance before the ceremony, a casual remark to fit the day's excitement. But in the years since, with the smears appearing again and again, the phrase took on a far darker resonance. The private investigator hired by the family in the early years still visited them occasionally, though he admitted he had run out of new leads long ago. He remained convinced that someone alive knew exactly what had happened, but the absence of physical evidence had kept that person or persons untouchable. He was less certain about the lipstick appearances. He didn't dismiss them outright, but he told the Canes he believed if they were man-made, they were being placed deliberately to keep the mystery alive, either by the person responsible for her disappearance or someone exploiting the case for attention. He offered to install additional cameras around the family home in case the marks ever extended beyond Hollowford, but so far they had not. The bridesmaids, most of whom had drifted apart after the tragedy, rarely spoke about the wedding. In private conversations, some admitted that they avoided looking too long into mirrors when alone. One said she had been at another wedding years later, when she thought she saw, in the corner of her eye, a flash of white fabric in the reflection. She turned quickly and saw nothing. She kept it to herself. For the police, the case file now held as many reports about the post-disappearance events as it did about the original search. Each lipstick smear had been photographed, catalogued, and tested, yet the results were always the same. Same shade, same composition, same smudged prints. Nothing to prove anything in court, nothing that could lead to an arrest. Hollowford Estate still operates, though the upper floors remain off-limits to most guests. Staff turnover is high. Those who stay long enough to experience a smear's sudden appearance tend to handle it quietly, wiping the glass and saying nothing. The owners no longer call the police for every occurrence, preferring to avoid renewed media interest. The guests who hear whispers about the history often seek out the corridors after dark, hoping for a glimpse. Most see nothing. A few leave unsettled, claiming they caught sight of a faint outline in the mirror, gone as soon as they looked directly. The Canes continued to attend every memorial vigil held on the anniversary of Marissa's disappearance. They stand with candles in hand, listening to the names of other missing persons read aloud, their daughters among them. When reporters approach, they speak plainly. They want answers, not stories. They want to bring her home, not to speculate about lipstick marks in an old building. And yet, despite their resistance to the sensational aspects of the case, the smears keep appearing. Sometimes weeks apart, sometimes days in a row, always the same deep crimson, always fresh, always without a single recorded witness. The phrase in Marissa's note, "I'll see you in the mirror," remains as puzzling now as it was on the day she vanished. To some, it is a coincidence. To others, it is the only explanation they need. In the official records, the disappearance of Marissa Kane is unsolved. There is no suspect in custody, no confirmed cause, no evidence of life or death. But inside the Hollowford estate, the mirrors still bear their quiet, repeating message, a message that no one, not even those who claim to have stopped believing, can entirely ignore. And each time it appears, whether in the dead of winter or on the eve of a wedding, the deep crimson curve of that lipstick mark forces everyone who sees it to ask the same unanswered question: who or what is still leaving it there?